Good evening and welcome. This is The Chase. I'm Andy Hodges. Sustainable Development Goal 10 is about reduced inequality and is one of the 17 Sustainable Development Goals established by the United Nations in 2015. The full title of SDG 10 is Reduced Inequality Within and Among Countries. The goal has 10 targets to be achieved by 2030. Now, the current COVID-19 environment has resulted in increased inequalities amongst nations and states. These inequalities have permeated to the micro and macro levels, affecting families in different ways, including how they operate and relate to each other. Unfortunately, the pandemic has hit the hardest vulnerable groups, which include women, children and people living with disabilities, and threatens to have a greater impact on the poorest countries. This is because of regulations imposed by countries to contain the spread of coronavirus, which mostly limited people's movement outside of the home. As a result, many people have had to rely on technology to keep their lives going. But technology has both a positive and negative impact. Some people had gadgets, but a good percentage of people did not. They didn't even have access to them because of poverty. This means they got left behind in many ways. In many countries, women's unpaid workload increased during the COVID lockdown, as well as the different forms of gender abuse within the family unit. Join me and my guests as we discuss families and new technologies in relation to SDG 10, live on The Chase. Welcome back. This is The Chase, Zimbabwe's premier current affairs program, live from ZTN studios in Harare, Zimbabwe. Our discussion this evening, families and new technologies, SDG 10, reduced inequalities, public dialogue. This broadcast is brought to you by Zim Paper's TV network ZTN in partnership with UN Zimbabwe. Now, to our millions of viewers joining online throughout Zimbabwe, Africa, Europe, America, the Middle East and Asia, we would like to hear from you. So please join this discussion on our Twitter handle at ZTN News and on our Facebook page, Zim Paper's TV network. So please make sure we hear your voice. Now, joining us this evening on The Chase to discuss families and new technologies, SDG 10, Reduced Inequalities, Public Dialogue, we are joined in the studio by Pinit Shanthalangsi. He's Unit Head for Social and Human Sciences, UNESCO Regional Office for Southern Africa. Sandra Helen Gutei from Innovator Against Gender-Based Violence, Spotlight Initiative, and Edna Masiwa, Executive Director, Women's Action Group, or WAG. And joining us telephonically, we also welcome Jasper Mangwana. He's President of the Internet Society Zimbabwe Chapter and Executive Director of Zimbabwe Youth SDGs. We had invited Zimbabwe's Minister of ICT, Postal and Courier Services, Honorable Jenfan Muswere, to join us on today's program, but unfortunately, he was unable to make it. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to The Chase.
Thank you.
Thank you. Good evening.
Good evening. Now, Pinit, let me start with you. Now, one major impact of the COVID-19 pandemic is the increased usage of technology in our daily lives. This, however, appears to have come with advantages and disadvantages. I mean, I remember a funny story where we heard stories of people texting each other on platforms while sitting next to each other in the house. So what are these advantages, disadvantages? And furthermore, what has been the impact on families due in part to new technologies?
So, Andy, you know, when we talk about new technologies, and we need to, first of all, recognize one fact which is undeniable. New technologies have brought many positive sides during the lockdown, during the COVID-19. If you take, for instance, you know, education, remote learning has become, you know, a very normal way of learning now using new technologies. And you have so many students connected via different platforms, and the UN in Zimbabwe, for instance, have also provided, you know, different platforms to facilitate a learning process. So this is undeniable. Communication as well, between individuals, but also between families. But I'd like to focus now on some notions that are important. Social inequalities have also driven apart many individuals and families. And we have had experience, you know, personally, contrasted experience where you see that we use new technologies to communicate and to stay in touch with each other, but at the same time we end up also in isolation, as you mentioned earlier. So we have a collective hyperconnectivity, and at the same time we have individual isolation. And Many studies have showed that since the internet has penetrated households, people spend less time together in the family, resulting in many symptoms of depression, for instance, or a sense of isolation. So these are some of the paradoxical situation where we're in, where we have hyper-connectivity, but at the same time, isolation of individuals as well.
I don't want to say what my age is, but I remember that we used to read books when I was younger, and nowadays it appears no one reads books anymore. You just go on the internet and boom, everything is there. So I can see your point there about both advantages and disadvantages. Edna, let me come to you. Women's Action Group, or WAG, its mission is to develop products and tools for unlocking women's power to claim and enjoy their rights in violence-free and rights-conscious communities. So, in your opinion, did the proliferation of new technologies, especially brought about by COVID-19, I think Pinith there mentioned some of them and how it's undeniable, the fact that we're in a new world, so to speak. Did it assist or hinder your mission, do you think?
When I look at the impact of COVID and the issue of technology, it has had both effects. It has hindered as well as assisted. When we look at assisting, we are talking about working with women across Zimbabwe. And this has been made possible through technology, because now we can talk through WhatsApp, we can create WhatsApp groups for our messages, so it's easier to deliver messages to the women and girls out there using technologies. We also are noticing that we now have toll-free numbers where women can phone in if they are experiencing any form of violence, which is much cheaper. It's a much cheaper way. Women don't have to get onto the buses to come to the offices. We can do online counseling and psychosocial support. So those have been the positives of technology during the COVID era. But coming on to the negatives, we have heard a lot about revenge pornography, where there is intimate partner violence. And we have had nude pictures that have been shared through WhatsApp, through Facebook. So that has really hit the communities very hard. It's a negative. We also have noted that in the education sector, it's not everyone who has gadgets for the online lessons, learning. So this has been... It has worsened the inequalities which we are talking about that exist in society. So it's also an issue of concern. So there are positives as well as
like anything good
negatives.
And bad. Sandra, let me come to you. The Spotlight Initiative goals are ending violence against women and girls with the aim of ending all forms of violence against women and girls by 2030. In Africa, the initiative aims to eliminate sexual and gender-based violence, including harmful practices, and it will scale up existing initiatives on fighting female genital mutilation and child marriages across the region. In Zimbabwe, for example, which I saw this out from your website, a group of young volunteers known as Innovators Against Gender-Based Violence developed a WhatsApp group called Taking a Stand Against GBV to educate, inform, discuss and provide referral services to survivors and women experiencing gender-based violence, particularly during the COVID-19 pandemic. So look at that as an example. Have new technologies helped or hindered your organization in achieving your aims and goals?
Thank you. Like what my colleague just said, that indeed the coming in of new technologies is like a double-edged sword. It has its own merits and also its challenges that it came up with. But for us as the innovators against gender-based violence, the new technologies paved a way for us to reach out to communities, to reach out to women, to have dialogue, discussions on violence against women and girls, and then the women could also access services online, like what she said, that there's counseling, there's legal services, quite a number of toll-free lines were introduced during the coming in of the pandemic. So that came in as an advantage. If it was not for the new technologies, the movement was restricted. So where you could not be physically there, it means you could not reach out to the women. That's more vulnerability for the women and girls. So it doesn't, with new technology, there's no need for physical presence. You can give the services without being there. But in terms of the disadvantages that come with new technology is that it facilitates violence against women and girls in most cases, in some cases, where there's sharing of photos. So from my, I would think that the introduction of the new technologies need to come up with education and literacy, as well as enforcement of regulations. So how can the women and girls be protected? Do they know what they are getting themselves into when they are giving their photos to the boys, when they're giving their photos to the men? Do they know that at the end of a relationship, these photos can be sent to everyone else, and then 10 years later it will come back? So those are the dynamics that come with technology that I think we can address and then drive and build on the force that technology has.
So interestingly enough, then technology actually has an impact on GBV, or violence against women and young girls, because of things like child pornography and so on, and how people abuse the system. Yeah, I see what you're saying. Now we're now joined telephonically by Jasper Mangwana, President, Internet Society Zimbabwe, and Executive Director, Zimbabwe Youth SDGs. Jasper, welcome to The Chase.
Thank you so much, Andy. It's a great pleasure to be on the show.
Oh, no, so it's a pleasure having you, and thank you for giving us your time. Jasper, you heard what Sandra was saying there about all these new technologies, but of course literacy campaigns, education and so forth are important. So are you aware, Jasper, if Zimbabwe has a policy framework to deal with new technologies, especially with regards to reaching vulnerable groups in Zimbabwe, which of course includes women, children and people living with disabilities?
Thanks so much, Andy. What I'd say is that we have noted that the ministry had a flight say that they're launching the master plan for ICT strategy for 2021 to 2025, which is in line with the national vision of 2030, which is an upper middle income economy, which is succeeding the previous plan, which ran during 2016 to 2020. But in that, I quote the minister what he said in time, in saying that this policy is looking at 4 key core values, which are transparency, professionalism, creativity, and teamwork. And we really need to see this happening on the ground, over and above the activities that we've seen the government taking, considering that we've seen a lot of distribution of hardware, equipment, which are laptops and desktops, as well as connectivity to primary and secondary schools, especially those in marginalized communities, which is actually a testimony to the Q4 results of Regulatory Authority report for 2020, which states that our mobile subscribers rose by 3.2%, which means close to almost 13,191,000 people are already online. They've increased the mobile subscribers, and we're looking at our population. It means the children or the young ones now have access to mobile devices. You also look at the penetration rate, which was actually about 2.8% increase by the fourth quarter, which takes the whole nation to about 90.5%. You also look at the internet and data subscription. It also grew by 1.7%. You also look at the mobile and data usage, which grew by actually 13.1% in terms of the traffic that we've been using. That is as of the last quarter of 2020, which was roughly about 16,834 terabytes, which justifies the need for this policy to start working. Of course, we appreciate that from the concerns we've had with the minister, it's in line with the Sustainable Development Goals, which makes a key issue to SDG 10, which talks about reduced inequalities, because you can't really compare education in urban areas and education in rural communities. And you also note that in terms of access to this internet, it does not fit any business case for telecommunications players to go and put internet at a rural school, which might not require much, but they look where the business case is. But we appreciate and want to applaud the government, because recently they've called for what they call community networks, which are networked by the community for the community, which provide cheap and affordable internet at low-cost products. We've seen the first internet community network in Zimbabwe launched by the Minister of ICT, as well as the Director General last week.
Jasper, I want to ask you this. I mean, in your opinion, what are the advantages and disadvantages of new technologies on families? I mean, can they be used to reduce inequalities? I mean, that's a goal, of course, of SDG 10. Can they be used to leave no one behind?
Thanks so much, Andy. That's very true. If you look at technology, like I want to second what Sandra was saying, that it's actually a double-edged sword, because if you look at what we think technology might actually affect in terms of the social being of a family, you look at reducing socialization, reducing family time, because now everyone is busy on the phone. So there's no really time to interact. There's not much time to talk about. We have seen the increase in terms of a lot of people now they've gone overdrive in terms of addiction to internet. You also talk about influencing childhood development. You know, when you grow up in our communities, we know that the child is groomed by a mother. You know, the values and the cultures of Zimbabwe, or maybe from your totem of where you come from, you really pick them from your seniors. But because of the internet now, we have provided a short circuit of identity and modeling, where we are seeing our youngsters, our generations to come being bonded by the internet, rather than the community and the society that we used to live in, including the traditional leaders. So that's another aspect that we can talk on, the negativity of the internet. But at the same time, I think that if wherever you are, you're now joining the global village. You can work in America living in Zimbabwe.
Right,
So,
yeah.
Internet.
So there are advantages and disadvantages, in your opinion?
Yes, you can actually learn. You can have the best curriculum, which is given to a child in India, well.
Right.
The beauty of technology. At the same time, also, the other important thing, Eddie, is to look at the digital the gap divide in terms of the skills, digital skills. You know, the old generation might struggle with this technology, but these youngsters who are going these days, they are very much far ahead in terms of understanding these things. That's the reason why I want to second one of the panelists was talking about the notes being circulated and all that, because they know the functionalities in these telephones, which a lot of older generation may not be using them. So I think it's important for us to really have this policy on the road to ensure that we really push to reduce the inequalities, especially economically for people with disability, the young people. Actually, the people that are actually the majority users of technology are the young people, because if you're saying almost 8 million people are using internet, and you look at the statistics in Zimbabwe, below 35 years, actually almost 65%. So
okay,
young people.
I need to come back into the studio. I like that, technologically challenged at a certain age. It's interesting. Finit, one component of new technologies is that, as I said earlier, the poorest members of our society, persons living with disabilities, women, children, and the youth may be unable to access new technologies. I heard Jasper's comments there, 13 million people, the internet access is going up, data is going up, and so forth. But there is a hurdle. There's no doubt about it. How, in your opinion, do you think that this apparent hurdle can be overcome?
This is striking, you know, in our conversation. The notion of intersectional discrimination and inequalities has coming up very, very clearly. You know, inequality is challenged when you have, you know, gender coming in, your geographic location, your socioeconomic background, and all of these, your disabilities or abilities. So, I mean, access to internet and new technologies is not an exception. Intersectional discrimination come into play, and when you're a person with disabilities, of course you have access to internet and devices, but we have to talk about accessibility of all of these devices. And the good news is that there are plenty of software that could facilitate you know, access for persons with disabilities. So policymakers, CSOs, but also families need to really look for these software and make them known to the general public. Now, another aspect I wanted to stress on is about, you know, radios and community media. I don't know whether they are low-tech, middle-tech, or high-tech, or whatever, but I mean, during lockdown situations, we sometimes have overlooked the impact and still the influence of community radios or TV for education, for socialization, etc. And I think we need to continue to invest also on community media.
So it isn't just about
radios.
smartphones, laptops, tablets. It's also about, if we can call it, low-tech solutions that we've always had, like radio, TVs, and so on. Absolutely,
because these are more accessible to the poorest of our societies. And I know that Zimbabwe is working on a license for community radios, and I think that would be an excellent development. But in the meantime, there are already so many organizations, associations, you know, promoting community media, which is a bit broader than community radios. And I think it is also our responsibility as policymakers and responsible officers to also look into a broader scope of technologies, not only focusing on internet and new technologies and artificial intelligence, but also taking into account the current media that are very plural and very diverse.
So how can we exploit current media or current channels rather than sort of putting all our money into brand new technologies? We might as well try and combine the two until they both work effectively together. I think that's the key. Yeah. You're watching The Chase, Zimbabwe's premier current affairs program. Our discussion this evening, families and new technologies, SDG 10, reduced inequalities, public dialogue. This broadcast is brought to you by Zim Papers TV network ZTN in partnership with UN Zimbabwe. Remember, please, we would like to hear from you. So join this discussion on our Twitter handle @ZTN News and on our Facebook page, Zim Papers TV network. So make sure we hear your voice. Jasper, do you know if there's a plan as it relates to access to such infrastructure or new technologies? For example, access to the internet and the high cost of access. I mean, you gave us some statistics there, 13.1 million people technically are connected and so on. But there is a big issue, is there not, Jasper? The affordability of these new technologies. It's out of the reach of a majority of our citizens. Your comment?
Thanks so much, Andy. I agree with you 100% that the cost of access to internet is really on the killing side. But we've seen some strides in the government, like I said, the launch of community networks. These are networks for the community, by the community, which means they are going to be, the community decides in terms of the costing structure. Where what we are saying, the contract is called for community internet service providers, district internet service providers that might charge lesser cost, because remember, for the big ISPs, internet service providers that work in Zimbabwe, for them to give you internet, they need a justification in terms of cost-based benefit analysis. It has to make a business sense. But now the government has said, no, we are capable of registering community networks. So right now the applications are closed 31st of May for the first batch of applications. We're encouraging a lot of other different players and people in the raw community. We've seen the first one in Murambinda. This will bring the internet at reasonable cost. At the same time, also the other aspect is Andy, the content that our people are accessing from abroad, which is expensive for the internet service providers. We've seen the government working on what they call internet exchange points. Host our own local content, promote the local content. The education sector has grown up in terms of Google Classroom and what they need. But remember, Google is not in Harare, it's not in Zimbabwe, which means it's more traffic that is required to go outside, which then gives an extra cost on our internet service providers. Whereas if these applications or these systems are hosted locally in Zimbabwe, it becomes easy because they'll be peering. It's like local traffic, local national traffic, but when it goes international, it means the cost associated. So I think it's up to us to also see what content are we creating as a nation. We have seen the zero rating in terms of other websites for university and all that, but because the data is so much increasing, we need to come with the players together to say, as government, as regulators, how do we then at the end of the day ensure that those that cannot afford, they get internet at a reasonable price? So the issues about access, reliable internet, and also cost. So if we address that to our home and right, but I believe we have a long way to go to ensure that by 2030 we would have done our target.
Pinit, I want to focus on SDG 10, of course, reducing inequality within and among countries. Evidence shows that this has only widened in line with the COVID-19 pandemic. I think you spoke about that earlier. I mean, COVID, as I said, has hit hardest the poorest and most vulnerable communities in Zimbabwe. It has also put a spotlight on economic inequalities and fragile social safety nets that leave vulnerable communities to bear the brunt of the crisis. At the same time, social, political, and economic inequalities have amplified the impacts of the pandemic. In what other ways has COVID-19 impacted on the attainment of SDG 10? And how can the family unit play its key role in reducing practices that promote gender inequalities?
You know, Andy, the UN estimates show that this particular pandemic is projected to push back the poorest nations and the poorest groups by about a full 10 years in their progress towards the achievement of SDGs.
Okay, so wait, so SDG is supposed to be 2030. You're saying now reports have shown 2040 could be because of the pandemic.
If policies and actions are not taken to really contain and care for social equalities in recovering from this pandemic, will have pushed back, 10 years in achieving the progress. So this is, a historical moment in time where we are in, and we need to also take into account another factor which is of interest to us here on gender. UNFPA has estimated that every 3 months of lockdown results in an average of 15 million cases of gender-based violence.
Wow.
So when talking about SDG 10, gender equality SDG 5 is also related and come in interplay with this particular SDG 10. And I think it is very, very important that we have a gender lens when analyzing the social inequalities that we are facing today in achieving SDGs. Now, let me also focus on a long-term impact, which is related to education, which is one of the sectors that we have discussed a lot this evening. You know that since the lockdown had started in many countries all around the world, 1.5 billion of school-going children have gone out and dropped out from school, and among them 50%, slightly over 50%, have no access to remote learning facilities at all, either because there's no device, it is not affordable, or even schools have not set up a remote learning policy or measures or program. So, we are talking here about generations that would be missing schools for many, many months, and it will be very, very challenging for them to recover back and reintegrate the schools. And here again, if we apply the gender lens, 50% and above of these dropout of schools are girls, young girls and young students. Now, what is really dramatic is that we know by experience and by also research that it is much more difficult to reintegrate girls than boys back to schools when they have already dropped out. Now, what does it mean? It means that sexual exploitation could increase, forced marriage should increase, early unintended pregnancy could also increase. So, SDG 10, when you look at it with the lens of gender and also intersectional discrimination that we have mentioned earlier, it is really dramatic if we don't, develop and roll out policies that are really proactive.
So it's critical to have policies in place to look at some of these issues.
Absolutely.
Now,
and yeah.
Sandra, I want to bring you in very quickly before I move on. It's interesting that because, particularly during the COVID-19 lockdown, I heard of cases where children have been pulled out of school to help their families make money. And then, of course, when schools reopened, it appears, and I only quote this because I read it somewhere, that the boys get back to school and sometimes the girls remain to continue helping their families, whether it's selling produce or whatever on the street. So it is an issue, isn't it? As much as COVID-19 has affected us, it's also impacted young women and girls even more substantially because of some of these dynamics.
Yes, it has, because the issues of gender equality and inequalities, they are rooted mostly in cultural and religious beliefs and the various norms that are socialized even at a very young age. So usually when there's an emergence, when a critical situation, it is usually the girl child who has to pay the price.
I looked at some of the numbers, and particularly from the UN and some of the reports they've done on the impact of COVID-19, especially as it relates to SDG 10. It's put at risk, and I think Pin has said this, it's put at risk the limited progress that has already been made to achieving SDG 10. He mentioned possibly 10 years even, unless policies are implemented now. And and this is a key objective of SDG 10 is gender equality and women's rights. Across every sphere, from health to the economy, security to social protection, the impact of COVID-19 are exacerbated by women and girls simply by virtue of their sex.
Yes.
So why is this the case? I understand it. Is this about family units that put more value on the boys than on the girls? What is the underlying reason for this inequality in families themselves, which is the issue, isn't it?
Like I said before, it's the issues of patriarchy, the issues of culture, the issues of religion. So what has happened is, even from generations past, families have grown to understand that, you know, boys are more important than girls. So what happens is when there's an emergency situations, it is the girls that suffer. You know, it's like if you look at a woman who bears only girl children, the kind of stigma that the lady gets just by having girl children. So that one alone increased the vulnerability of our girls. Then you go back to why the pandemic has exacerbated the inequalities, because the issues of access and control of resources. So because of patriarchy, like I said, it is usually the men who've got access and control. So the one who has got access and control is the one who has got power. So we have got limited resources, and the one who've got power is the one who benefits the most. So women and girls become more vulnerable.
Now, you know, over the years, WAG's efforts have contributed to the enactment of the Domestic Violence Act. You've had input in the process of the development of the National Gender Policy. You've contributed to the Sexual Offences section of the Criminal Law Codification and Reform Act, and you've engaged traditional leaders in HIV prevention and reduction of gender-based violence. But have you noticed, due to COVID-19, setbacks in your efforts? And in your opinion, how effective has been the role of families in fighting inequality?
As has already been highlighted, the gap between the poor and the rich has widened to date because of COVID-19. What we have seen in our work is even access to services such as the sexual health services and gender-based violence services is very difficult during lockdown periods, where women and children are not allowed maybe to leave their homes. I mean, when you look at even the policy framework, the first lockdown was looking at those going to work, and they required a letter for someone to access, to pass a roadblock. So for the women who wanted to go to for maternity services, they also faced challenges there.
They couldn't get the letter.
Yes, even those who are HIV positive, who were supposed to go and get their refill for their medication, had challenges as well. Even when they were allowed to pass the roadblocks, issues of confidentiality were broken because someone had to show a card saying what exactly they are going out there for. So the COVID era has really brought about this.
Can I ask you a question, though? Do you think that these inequalities were there before, but sort of hidden, and COVID-19 has really brought them to the forefront of what we're now seeing?
They were there before, but they were made worse. They were made worse, like when we talk about issues of confidentiality, you having to show whoever is manning a roadblock your card to show that you are going for treatment.
It's embarrassing. It's a stigma and everything.
Yes, it promoted stigma. It promoted people going under, not talking, or maybe choosing not to go to the clinic. So, and as we talk about the issue of technology, we hear some were able to use telehealth, where you could just phone your pharmacy, your medication would be dropped at your doorstep. But there are communities who could not access that service. So we are talking inequality, and those who have continue to be.
I mean, Pinna said this. I mean, he's right in what he's saying, is that geographics also plays a part. So you could be in, say, Wusape and be fine, but if you were in Ngokwe, for example, it could be a completely different situation due to access to internet, having the right providers there, and so on and so forth. So you're right. There are a lot of multifaceted issues that we have to look at. Jasper, you know, it's an interesting question. I suppose I should have asked you this earlier, but we're talking on this show about new technologies. But what exactly are these new technologies we're actually talking about? You know, what does this link into when you look at it from a Zimbabwe context?
Thanks so much, Andy. I think new technologies are quite a lot here because there's still a lot of emerging technologies that are coming on board. But one thing that I want to say maybe is what exciting people now is push on video. I think you have seen the rise of TikTok. What it means someone is pushing video. It means also the amount of content you're also pushing is also huge, because there's difference between voice and text. So young people these days, they're pushing TikTok, they're pushing Twitter, they're pushing YouTube. I think you've seen a lot of cases where some families have been broken because of some of these technologies that are coming on board. You're also seeing a lot of traffic coming on WhatsApp. These are the technology that you can't run away from. If you're going to be in a working environment, you can't run away from Zoom. If you're in school, you can't run away from Microsoft Teams. You can't run away from Google Classroom.
But,
because
but Jasper, if I can just jump in here. I mean, but the issue with what you're saying, I suppose, is that you may talk about YouTube, TikTok, and so forth, but I would assume that's a very small portion of our population that actually utilizes that kind of technology. I mean, if you are now looking, say, at the rural areas, which is where a majority of our citizens actually live, I mean, what kind of technologies would assist them, not just families, but individuals, to access some of these issues to reduce inequalities?
Thanks so much, Andy. You know, one thing that I want to applaud is that if you look at the cost of access to technology in terms of the bundles, a bit on the higher end, but in terms of the devices required for you to connect, because you've seen a massive expansion in terms of base station construction in rural, remote areas, including some community radios, and also because the competition in manufacturers, we've seen a lot of mobile phones coming in, which we've got the facility to connect on the internet at affordable prices, which is actually better for those that are in rural communities. But our worry is in terms of the cyber savvy. Do they understand what the internet brings to them?
This is the education that Sandra was talking about, education and literacy in terms of new technologies.
Yes, even though we can't take away the fact that those in rural communities, Andy, they might not have these devices, they might not have access to this technology because of where they are coming from, but what they need is a basic computer to understand how it works, and also to get a lecture really given to them in a way that they understand, because either we like it or not, radio lessons are one-way communication, they're not two-way, there's no, it can be interactive, and this has not been really doing much good for those that are in rural communities. So I think as these technologies are coming on board, there's need for us to really push with the devolution agenda to ensure that in any district, in any province, how many schools are there, how many are connected, and when they are connected, what are they doing? Surprisingly, Andy, some of these schools you visit them, you find computers that were donated some 10 years ago, they've become obsolete. You can't use them anymore, but they never use them. Why? Because the requirements that are needed, some need power, some need solar power to ensure that they're connected. Some need just a link, but I've seen the government through Potras and the ministry, they've deployed internet through Zanet in some remote schools, but we hope they'll continue to provide this support, because remember, these guys are not capable of paying for themselves every month, because you look at the fees they charge, they might be charging maybe 50 RTGS a term, and then you expect them to pay for internet that will cost them maybe roughly about $100 in a month. They cannot afford that. So there's need for government and partners to come together and say, how do we then drive the roadmap to connect a specific province or a specific district at a cost that is reasonable to the people that are going to be required?
I mean, Jasper, I mean, you're right. I mean, we don't want to leave anyone behind, but there are those, let me call them infrastructure costs that need to be looked at, because, you know, pretty much in developed countries, access to the internet is a standard thing for everybody. It doesn't matter who you are. But in Africa, and particularly in Zimbabwe, it does come with its cost, and those costs can be expensive. You're watching The Chase, Zimbabwe's premier current affairs program. Our discussion this evening, families and new technologies, SDG 10, reduced inequalities, public dialogue. This broadcast is brought to you by Zimpaper's TV network ZTN in partnership with UN Zimbabwe. Remember, of course, we'd like to hear from you on this important topic. Join the discussion on our Twitter handle at ZTN News and via our Facebook page, Zimpaper's TV network. So as usual, make sure we hear your voice. Edna, you know, I like the last part of our discussion, of course, is the way forward. So what would be your recommendations to the government and civil society organizations, of course, on how effectively to combine policy frameworks and the utilization of new technologies, particularly to achieve SDG 10 by 2030, which of course reduce inequality within and among countries, especially as it relates to women and girls?
I think to start with, let's have maybe information kiosks in remote areas so that we address the inequality that exists around the issue of access. So if we could decentralize the gadgets out of the cities, that would also help. And we should also look at issues like schooling, where students should also have access to these latest gadgets which they can use for their learning, because we are talking about inequalities, but at the pace we are going, I think we are broadening the inequalities.
But do you think SDG 10 is achievable, as Pinot said, if we take strong policy measures now to make sure it happens?
Yes, true.
And of course, later on, I will ask you both if you can. I don't know if you have any toll-free numbers, because this is important, because if there are any women out there who are suffering from GBV, they can reach out to your organization. Do you have a number that you could give our...
They could phone 339292. It's a Harare number.
339292, so 0242 339292. So please reach out to WAG if you need to, if anything is happening to you where you are. Sandra, let me ask you the same question. You know, what would be your recommendations to authorities and CSOs so that SDG 10 can be successfully implemented by 2030? You know, what needs to be done in your opinion?
I think evidence-based programming is important, like what Pinot says, that we are talking of new technologies, but we've got, in terms of SDG 10, which is reduced inequalities, so what we need to do is we need to look into Zimbabwe. So what is Zimbabwe? What are the issues pertaining to Zimbabwe as a country? Then how best can we address this? Because each country is unique. So once we gather evidence and then we respond accordingly, like what you are saying, that, you know, when you are looking at new technologies, we have got our local radio, community radios. We can harness those, we can build on those, make sure that even our rural women are not left behind. So we are not just talking about smartphones, we are not talking about YouTube, but we can use our local radios, we can use our community radios.
But I want to just quickly, very briefly, get back to what you talked about earlier, education. I think Edna mentioned community information booths, for example. That's a critical component that I don't think we're really doing so effectively in Zimbabwe as well as we should be. What would be your comment to that?
Sorry, Ken.
Information or education of our people in terms of using new technologies. Because, you know, it's all well and good saying someone has a smartphone, but at the same time, Jasper talked about cybersecurity issues. We talked about revenge porn, pornography, and so on. I mean, that component seems to be a little bit lacking in what we've been discussing.
Yeah, yes, that's important. I think it's something that CSOs can work on, something that even schools can work on, because now with the new curriculum per se, children are now going to school with cell phones. But even at school, are there lessons, are there platforms where where children can be educated on what are the harmful, the effects of using technologies in a so what are the advantages and disadvantages of technology? They need to know
exactly what they are. Yes. So now, before I move to finish the show with Jasper and Pinot, I just want to ask you both very quickly, which is the theme of our show, which is really about families and how families can play an important role in reducing inequalities, especially with regards to promoting gender inequalities. And so the question is, how can new technologies assist in this effort? Do you think more needs to be done or not? Because families are critical, aren't they? I mean, we need to start educating at families. You talked about stigma in families, particularly in Africa. We need to get rid of that mental attitude, so to speak.
I think at family level, there's also need to discuss the advantages and disadvantages of the new technologies. Because what I've noticed is at family level, normally it's the children who are advanced in technology, whilst the parents are also lagging behind.
Technologically challenged.
So there is need for that intergenerational discussion around that. And as we use our gadgets, we should also, at family level, discuss on having quality time as a family, rather than spend most of the time on our individual gadgets. Yeah. So we can, as a family, agree that from 5 p.m. to 8 p.m., we are not on our phones or laptops. We are having quality time. Because really family is important in even passing down the value system of a society, starting from the family. So we really need to inculcate that in our modern families so that we have family time.
Family time is critical. Sandra, your brief comment on that.
Yeah, like what she's saying, that, you know, yes, children are now more advanced in terms of technology, but we also see parents who are not being good role models in terms of how they use their technology. So you see a mother comes home, she's always on the phone. So what the child does is, by the time he or she also gets a phone, she's also spending more time on the phone. So it's the parents first, and then when the children got access to their phones, they're also on their phone. So it's just about parents being role models in terms of how they use also their gadgets.
Yeah. Thank you. Jasper, let me come to you for your final question. It appears that ICT, if used correctly, can and should play a key role in reducing inequalities. So in your opinion, what needs further to be done to achieve this important goal, or let me just call it what it is, SDG 10?
Thanks so much, Andy. I think it's unfortunate that the technology is overtaken our models and our policies, that we have to catch up with it rather than define how it's going to be adopted, because we're supposed to have what they call a technology adoption model, either at family or at corporate. But I think innovations and maybe also the global development has pushed us to actually adopt this. But I believe, if you look at SDG 10, what is important, I want to agree with Sandra that these SDGs, we need to localize them to look at the Zimbabwean context. That's the reason why we've been pushing for a provincial SDG summit and consultations, getting information from our different sectors to say, in terms of inequalities in our provinces, in our rural districts, in our urban areas, in our young people, in our people with disability, in our young women, what exactly are their requirements, so that at least when we leverage on the technology, we know that we're leveraging on it in a sustainable manner. Because at the end of the day, we need to really have some signs to say, this is the direction we are going, and we should be pulling in that direction together to ensure that we leave nobody behind. But what is important is to ensure that it's sustainable. It's unfortunate that our youngsters now, they can do their own homework without really interference with the families, which makes really some father or some mother not really get to do the role that they're supposed to do to model their child in the direction they need, because the internet has defined the role models for them. The internet has given the inspiration for them. They actually even argue with their parents with the information from the internet. But not everything is from the internet is correct. So as you push for SDG 3 on reducing inequality, it's important for us to take what you think this is important and distribute it to other areas where the internet has not been adopted, to ensure that we bring the positive that we need our people to do, educate them, ensure that they get the information that is key to push Zimbabwe towards the Agenda 2030 of an upper middle income economy. Technology, you can't run away from it, because if we do that, we won't develop as a nation. We've seen the globe has gone in that direction. We need to go in that direction. We're also looking forward to the cybersecurity and data protection bill, because that is also going to define these inequalities, and also to see that the privacy is kept, the surveillance is also protected, and also looking at issues to do with internet freedom. But all this can be done when we have the bill on cybersecurity, which we're waiting for, I think, which is before Parliament, to ensure that these inequalities we're talking about, they're also part of the legal framework.
All right, I have to cut you there. Peneth, you're the last speaker here. I think you've heard all our panelists today, your own comments as well. Let's look at your experience. I mean, you have vast experience in this. What advice would you give? You talked earlier about policy moves that have to be made now. So what advice would you give to bring SDG 10 back on track? Well, of course, whose implementation has been affected by COVID-19, which you've highlighted extensively and very well. What needs to be done from a Zimbabwean context?
Well, I like, Edina mentioned earlier that conversation is important and discussion is important within the family. And I will now transpose it into the societal level as well. Conversation on social equality and social justice is really key. And I think unless we itemize it in the agenda of policy making, to make sure that social inequality is part and parcel of every policy, sectoral policies that are being developed, implemented, the achievement of SDGs will not happen. And I don't remember who said, if you think education is expensive, then try ignorance. And I would say here that if you think that social policies are costly or expensive, then try social inequalities, and that would give you a lot of conflicts and tensions and riots and I don't know what. So I think placing social equalities and social justice as the essential piece of our policy agenda is one thing. Let me come to a second aspect proper to Zimbabwe, but also prevalent globally. It is about birth registration. Now, you would ask me, what is the relation between birth registration and SDG 10 and social inequalities? Well, the last report of the Zimbabwe Human Rights Commission showed that in Zimbabwe, 2.3 million children have no birth certificate. It means that they have no access to social policies, they have no access to assistance from the social welfare, and at the end of the day, that increases social inequalities. The Commission also mentioned, a term that is very, very striking, which is unaffordable citizenship, because there are parts of citizens in the country that don't even have the basic documentation for them to access basic services. So I think implementing SDG 10 also requires us to fix this and to give the basic right to citizens to access documentation.
So we need a multi-stakeholder government plan and policies that put social programs and social policies at the forefront of whatever they need to do.
I think this is the precondition for the achievement of the SDGs and of the fundamental human rights in general. So I think this is really, placing social policies at the center of our action.
I think on that note, that brings the end of The Chase this evening. You've been watching The Chase, Zimbabwe's premier current affairs program. Our discussion this evening, Families and New Technologies, SDG 10, Reduced Inequalities, Public Dialogue. This broadcast is brought to you by Zimpaper's TV network ZTN in partnership with UN Zimbabwe. I'd like to thank my guest, Pinit Chantha Langsi, Unit Head for Social and Human Sciences, UNESCO Regional Office for Southern Africa, Sandra Helen Gutei from Innovator Against Gender-Based Violence, Spotlight Initiative, Edna Masiwa, Executive Director, Women's Action Group, or WAG, and Jasper Mangwana, President, Internet Society Zimbabwe, and Executive Director, Zimbabwe Youth SDGs. I will also mention that we had invited Zimbabwe's Minister of ICT, Postal and Courier Services, Honorable Jenfan Muswere, to join us on today's program, but unfortunately he wasn't able to make it. I'd like to thank you all for giving us your time to appear on The Chase this evening. Thank you very much, and thank you, Jasper.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Well, that's it for our show this evening. It's done for me. I'm Andy Hodges. Good night, and you all be safe.